Cedarville's Dark Secrets, uncovering the truth behind medical experiments and missing students. Chapter 1. The Silent Quarantine. The town of Cedarville lay shrouded in an uneasy stillness. It was as if the air itself had turned thick and oppressive, wrapping around the small, isolated community with a suffocating grip. The dense woods that bordered the town on all sides seemed to loom closer, casting long shadows over the empty streets. Normally, Cedarville bustled with the sounds of life, children's laughter at the park, conversations spilling out from the diner, the occasional hum of a passing truck. But now, all was silent. The quarantine had descended swiftly, as if in the dead of night. Rumors of a rapidly spreading illness had reached the ears of the townsfolk only hours before the lockdown was enforced. Soon, local authorities announced that the town's borders were sealed, leaving Cedarville cut off from the outside world. Homes that once echoed with warmth were now shuttered and dark, with blinds drawn tightly and doors bolted as if to keep some unseen force at bay. There was no warning and no explanation, only vague instructions to stay indoors and avoid contact with others. 17-year-old Jake Reeves stood at his bedroom window, staring out into the desolate street. A light drizzle had started, and raindrops streaked down the glass, blurring the world outside. He leaned his forehead against the window, letting the coolness seep into his skin. He had lived in Cedarville his entire life, and he'd never seen it like this, so devoid of its usual life and noise. The stillness felt wrong, unnatural, and a shiver crept down his spine. Jake glanced over at his desk where his laptop sat open, displaying the local news. Every article seemed to say the same thing: mysterious outbreak, precautionary lockdown, temporary measure. But Jake wasn't satisfied with those vague assurances. He was no stranger to diving into the unknown. He had always been drawn to mysteries, whether they involved a missing pet or the unmarked graves behind the old church that had fueled rumors of hauntings for decades. This, though, was something different. This wasn't a mystery he could just shrug off or dismiss as local folklore. Jake's phone buzzed, breaking the heavy silence. It was a text from Claire. "Meet us at the usual spot." The usual spot was a stretch of abandoned railroad tracks that ran behind the high school, a place where Jake, Claire, and Tommy had often gathered to exchange secrets, trade stories, and share moments away from the adult gaze. As Jake arrived, he saw Claire pacing back and forth, her hands shoved into the pockets of her denim jacket. She had an intense look on her face, her auburn hair falling over her eyes as she stared down at the ground, lost in thought. Tommy sat on a nearby rock, tossing pebbles into the grass, his usual humor noticeably absent. "Hey," Jake greeted, his voice low. "Any news?" Claire stopped pacing and looked up at him. "If you can call vague and useless headlines news, then sure," she replied with a hint of sarcasm. "Everything they're saying sounds rehearsed, like they've all got the same script." "Yeah," Tommy added, his expression unusually serious. "And have you noticed? People aren't just staying inside because they're scared. Some of them, they've been gone since before the lockdown started." Jake's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, gone? Remember Sarah from chemistry class?" Claire spoke up. "She stopped showing up about a week ago, before any of this. Her mom says she went to visit relatives in another state, but..." Claire hesitated, then shook her head. "Something about that doesn't sit right with me." "And it's not just Sarah," Tommy chimed in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. 3 other kids haven't been around either: Kevin, Angela, and Dave. And get this, they all had appointments at the Cedarville Medical Clinic in the days before they disappeared. Jake's stomach knotted with a sense of dread. "You think there's a connection?" Claire crossed her arms. "I don't know, but it's weird, right? I mean, first these students vanish, and now we're in lockdown because of some supposed virus. It feels like there's more going on than they're telling us." The 3 of them fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of the situation settling heavily over them. The drizzle had turned into a steady rain, pattering against the leaves and muddying the ground beneath their feet. As the days passed, the trio kept their eyes open for anything that seemed out of place. And there was plenty that didn't add up. For one, Dr. Caldwell, Cedarville's long-standing physician, seemed to be at the center of it all. He was often seen speaking with officials from out of town, his face grim and drawn. His clinic had become a hotspot of activity, with strange vans coming and going at odd hours. "Have you noticed Dr. Caldwell's been acting different?" Jake asked one evening as they huddled beneath a makeshift shelter they had built near the tracks. "He's always around when something's happening, and he's never been the type to stay that involved." Claire nodded. "I saw him talking to that man in the black suit, the one who's been hanging around the clinic. They were speaking in hushed tones, like they didn't want him to hear." "That guy's name is Agent Marshall," Tommy supplied, the words carrying a slight edge. "I overheard a couple of deputies mentioning him. They said he's with some government agency investigating the outbreak." "But why?" Jake leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "If this is just some virus, why do we need federal agents crawling around?" The air felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. None of them spoke for a moment, the weight of their speculations settling heavily over them. The raindrops drummed on the old train tracks, mingling with the distant echoes of the wind in the trees. Jake could feel a sense of dread worming its way into his thoughts. Cedarville had always been a quiet, sleepy town. The kind of place where nothing much happened, where life flowed at its own slow pace. But now, it was as if the entire town had slipped into another world. One where the rules didn't quite apply, and where the familiar had become strange. A few nights later, unable to sleep, Jake found himself wandering down Cedar Street, not far from the clinic. The darkened windows of the storefront seemed to watch him as he passed, and the streetlights buzzed faintly overhead. He kept his distance from the clinic itself, but lingered close enough to observe any activity. His patience was rewarded when he saw Dr. Caldwell and Agent Marshall emerge from the side entrance. They were speaking in low voices, and Jake strained to catch their words. "Containment protocols must be followed," Agent Marshall was saying. His tone was hard, unyielding. "We can't afford any leaks." Dr. Caldwell's reply was a strained whisper, almost desperate. "But the symptoms, they're getting worse. We need to be prepared for." "Enough," Agent Marshall interrupted, his voice a cold blade. "We don't need to create panic. Just keep this under wraps and follow the orders." Jake's breath caught in his throat as he ducked further into the shadows. His heart pounded, his pulse throbbing in his ears. He waited until the two men had disappeared back into the building before quietly slipping away, his mind racing with questions. What exactly were they hiding? And how much time did they really have before everything spiraled out of control? Chapter 2. The Missing and the Forgotten. Cedarville's stillness had shifted from unsettling to ominous. A heavy silence that seemed to press down on the town like a suffocating fog. The trio, Jake, Claire, and Tommy, had begun to understand that this was more than just a quarantine for a mysterious illness. The recent disappearances, the cryptic behavior of Dr. Caldwell and Agent Marshall, and the hastily imposed lockdown all pointed to something far darker lurking beneath the surface. Determined to uncover the truth, Jake and his friends set out to piece together the mystery, starting with those who had vanished. The first step was talking to the families of the missing students. The list had grown since they last met. In addition to Sarah, Kevin, Angela, and Dave, there were now two more names, Mia and Peter, both juniors at Cedarville High. Every one of them had one thing in common. Each had been to the Cedarville Medical Clinic shortly before they disappeared, though their visits were for trivial ailments, a sprained ankle, seasonal allergies, routine checkups. Jake found himself standing outside Sarah's house the next afternoon. The sky was overcast, casting a pale, washed-out light over the neighborhood. It felt as if the world were holding its breath. He hesitated before knocking, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. When Sarah's mother answered the door, her eyes were red from lack of sleep and an exhaustion that ran deeper than any mere fatigue. "Mrs. Collins, I'm Jake. I went to school with Sarah," he began awkwardly. "I was hoping you could tell me a little about her. Maybe anything unusual that happened before." The woman gave a weary nod and motioned him inside. "Not that there's much to tell," she said, her voice cracking. "One day she was here and the next, just gone. The police said she must have run away, but that's not like her. She wouldn't just leave without saying anything." Jake nodded sympathetically. "Did Sarah ever mention feeling different or noticing anything odd before she disappeared?" Mrs. Collins frowned, thinking back. She was uneasy. I remember she kept the blinds drawn all the time, and she said she had trouble sleeping. Kept talking about having strange dreams, about being watched, and there was something else. She hesitated, her expression darkening. She went to the clinic a week before she disappeared. She said it was just for some headache medication, but... Jake's pulse quickened. But what? She came back different, Mrs. Collins whispered. Withdrawn, nervous, like she knew something terrible was going to happen. Meanwhile, Claire and Tommy were making their own progress. Claire had stationed herself near the clinic, carefully observing the comings and goings, while Tommy dove into the town's history, searching for anything that could explain the recent string of events. The town library was eerily empty, its shelves lined with dust-covered books that hadn't been touched in years. He scoured old newspapers and municipal records, looking for any hint of a connection to the outbreak. Late one night, Tommy stumbled upon an article from nearly 20 years ago about a controversial medical experiment that had been conducted at the clinic under the supervision of a mysterious benefactor. The experiment had abruptly ended amid rumors of unexpected side effects and was quietly swept under the rug. Tommy's hands trembled as he photocopied the article, a creeping sense of dread washing over him. "Hey guys, you're not gonna believe this," he said the next day when they gathered at the tracks. He showed Jake and Claire the article. "The clinic's been involved in some sketchy stuff before. Are you saying this whole outbreak could be some kind of experiment?" Claire's voice was incredulous, but her eyes were wide with the chilling possibility. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. "It makes sense if you think about it. Those kids went to the clinic for something minor and then just vanished. And Dr. Caldwell is acting like he knows way more than he's letting on." Their investigation had begun to attract attention, and not all of it was welcome. It was early evening when Jake received the first of the unsettling phone calls. He answered without checking the caller ID, only to be met with nothing but static on the other end, followed by faint whispers that sounded like distorted voices, then a click as the line went dead. The calls persisted over the next few days, each time filling him with a growing sense of unease. Then one morning, as Jake opened his locker, a weathered notebook fell out, hitting the floor with a dull thud. It was Sarah's journal. The cover was scratched, the pages crinkled as if it had been hastily stuffed away. He flipped it open, his hands shaking slightly. The entries were a mix of daily musings and sudden bursts of paranoia. As he read, one phrase kept recurring: "I feel like I'm being watched." The entries grew increasingly disjointed, descending into fear-filled ramblings about hearing footsteps at night, seeing figures in the shadows, and sensing someone outside her window. Jake shared the journal with Claire and Tommy later that day. She wrote about feeling watched right after her last visit to the clinic. Jake said, "And look at this." He flipped to the final entry, where the handwriting was frantic, letters scrawled hastily across the page. "Last night, I saw someone in a lab coat at my window, just staring. I don't know who they are, but I think they're coming for me." The revelation hit like a blow. The possibility that Sarah and maybe the other missing students had been targeted for some reason was now undeniable. Realizing they needed more information, the friends decided to split up to cover more ground. Claire would keep watch on the clinic to see if any unusual activity occurred. Tommy would continue researching the clinic's past and any potential connections to the outbreak, while Jake resolved to speak with the families of the other missing students, hoping to find any clues that could shed light on what had happened. As they pursued their separate tasks, resistance began to mount. Town authorities seemed to be everywhere, discouraging inquiries and warning the teens to leave well enough alone. Even their parents had begun to pressure them to stop asking questions, echoing the same line: "The authorities know what they're doing." It was as if the entire town was falling under a blanket of fear, its residents becoming complacent, their voices fading into silence. Jake's attempts to reach Mia's parents were met with firm rejection. "We're not discussing Mia," her father said, his tone icy as he closed the door in Jake's face. At the library, Tommy found his access to records becoming limited, with certain files mysteriously marked restricted. Even Claire had noticed that whenever she lingered too long near the clinic, a patrol car would eventually pull up, and a stern officer would advise her to move along. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that there was something the authorities desperately wanted to keep hidden. One night, as Jake sat in his room going through Sarah's journal again, he came across something he had previously overlooked. There was a folded piece of paper tucked between the last few pages. It was a list of names: Sarah's, Kevin's, Angela's, Dave's, Mia's, and Peter's, and beside each was a date. It wasn't a list of their disappearances, though. The dates coincided with their visits to the clinic. Jake's heart raced as he read the final name on the list. Reeves, Jacob, 0923. The date was just 2 days away. A cold dread settled in his chest. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. Something had marked him too. But what was it, and how much time did he have before it was too late? Chapter 3. Lab Coats and Lies. The air in Cedarville had grown colder, and not just from the changing season. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake, Claire, and Tommy, however, were not waiting. They had dug themselves too deep into the mystery to turn back now, and the answers seemed to be just out of reach, locked behind layers of secrets, buried in years of deception. Tommy, having spent hours in the dusty corners of the town's library and combing through every available public record, had uncovered the first real clue about Cedarville's history. He had found only vague references to a Project Tranquility that took place in the 1980s. It had been a medical initiative funded by an unknown organization, ostensibly to research cures for various diseases. However, the deeper Tommy looked, the less sense it made. Several records had been sealed or marked classified, and he stumbled upon a pattern of unexplained outbreaks in Cedarville over the last few decades, each coinciding with unusual activity at the medical clinic. When Tommy brought the information to the group, Jake listened intently, his jaw tightening with each revelation. "So, Cedarville's been a testing ground for something?" he muttered. "And they're keeping it under wraps?" "We need to find out more," Claire said, her expression firm. "Starting with Dr. Caldwell. If he's involved in all of this, we need to know how deep it goes." Following Dr. Caldwell had been Claire's idea, and she was the best suited for it. She had always been resourceful, and her quiet, observant nature made her a natural for tailing someone without being noticed. She parked her bike behind the dense bushes near the clinic and watched as the doctor emerged, glancing around cautiously before driving off. Claire followed at a distance, her pulse quickening as he turned down a desolate road that led to the outskirts of town. It wasn't long before she spotted the facility, an old, nondescript building surrounded by a high fence and warning signs that declared the area off-limits. It looked abandoned from a distance, but as she moved closer, she saw signs of life. Lights flickered inside, and security cameras tracked her movements. Keeping out of sight, she crouched behind an overgrown hedge and watched as Dr. Caldwell met with Agent Marshall near the entrance. The two men were engaged in a heated exchange, their voices too low for her to hear. She edged closer, trying to catch fragments of their conversation. "It's getting out of hand," Caldwell was saying, his voice trembling with something that sounded like fear. "We can't keep this contained much longer." Agent Marshall's tone was cold, almost indifferent. "You'll do what's necessary, Doctor. The last thing we need is for anyone to start asking questions." Claire's heart raced. She fumbled for her phone, trying to record their conversation, but as she brought it up to film, a twig snapped under her foot. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the night. Both men froze, their heads turning toward her hiding spot. Claire quickly ducked out of view, holding her breath as footsteps approached. After what felt like an eternity, she heard Caldwell mutter, "It was probably just an animal," followed by the sound of their retreating footsteps. She waited a few more minutes before slipping away, her mind buzzing with what she had witnessed. The next day, Jake planned to follow up on a lead at Sarah's house. Sarah's younger brother had reached out to him, claiming to have found something that might help. But as Jake walked up the quiet street toward the Collins' house, he felt a prickle of unease. A figure stepped out from behind a tree up ahead, blocking his path, a man in a dark hoodie whose face was obscured by the shadows. "Looking for something, kid?" the man sneered, his voice low and menacing. Jake took a step back. "I was just visiting a friend." The man's hand darted out, grabbing Jake's shoulder in a painful grip. "Stay out of things that don't concern you," he hissed. "Last warning." Jake wrenched himself free and took off down the street, sprinting as hard as he could. He didn't look back until he was halfway across town, and even then, his lungs burned as he gasped for breath. His shoulder throbbed from where the man had gripped him, and paranoia crept over him like a chill. Was he being followed? Watched? That night, as Jake lay in bed, bruises throbbing and his thoughts racing, he was more determined than ever. He wasn't just going to uncover the truth, he was going to blow the whole thing wide open. The trio met the following night to share what they had learned. Claire's account of the confrontation between Dr. Caldwell and Agent Marshall, combined with Tommy's discovery of Project Tranquility, painted a grim picture. But it wasn't enough. They needed hard evidence, proof that they could take to the authorities, or if necessary, expose to the world. The only place that could hold such evidence was the facility that Claire had found. And so, armed with nothing more than flashlights, lock-picking tools, and a burning desire for answers, the three friends set out under the cover of darkness. Breaking into the facility proved easier than expected. Too easy, in fact. A single padlock on the side gate gave way after some careful maneuvering, and soon they were inside, creeping through shadowed corridors lined with old medical equipment and filing cabinets. The air was thick, with the stale smell of antiseptic. In one of the back rooms they found a lab, a real, functioning lab. The counters were covered with vials, syringes, and medical records. Filing cabinets stood against the walls, their drawers filled with patient files marked with the names of the missing students. Jake rifled through the records, his eyes widening as he read the details. The files didn't just list the students' medical histories. They contained references to clinical trials, observation notes, and ominous phrases like "subject response to treatment unstable." It was as if the students had been used as test subjects, their visits to the clinic an excuse to administer something experimental. "Look at this," Claire whispered, pointing to a series of charts on the wall. "It's a timeline of the disappearances, and something called Phase 2. Whatever that means, it's supposed to start soon." Before they could process what they had discovered, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. The trio froze, hearts pounding. Jake quickly shoved the documents back into the drawer, and they ducked behind a row of filing cabinets just as the door creaked open. Dr. Caldwell and Agent Marshall entered the lab, their conversation resuming as if they hadn't a care in the world. "Phase 2 is already in motion," Marshall was saying. "We just need to make sure no one interferes." Caldwell's voice trembled. "And what about the side effects? We're dealing with people, not just data points." Marshall's tone hardened. "That's not your concern, Doctor. Do your job, and I'll take care of the rest." Jake, Claire, and Tommy held their breaths, every muscle tense as the two men lingered. The air in the room felt suffocating, and the trio stayed perfectly still, hoping against hope that they wouldn't be discovered. Finally, Caldwell and Marshall turned to leave, their footsteps fading down the hall. As the silence returned, Jake let out a shaky breath. "We need to get out of here," he whispered. But even as they slipped out the way they came, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Chapter 4: Echoes of the Past. The town of Cedarville lay shrouded in a mist that seemed reluctant to lift, mirroring the weight of the secrets that hung in the air. Jake, Claire, and Tommy were no closer to finding the answers they needed. Only now, their situation had grown more dangerous. The shadow of their discovery inside the lab loomed over them. And the more they learned, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to twist into a darker shape. They regrouped in Jake's garage, which had turned into their unofficial headquarters. Claire was poring over the files they had managed to photograph before fleeing the facility. Her brows furrowed as she traced connections between names, dates, and medical procedures. "Listen to this," she said, breaking the silence. "There are notes about a Phase 1, early trials for a treatment aimed at enhancing brain function. The patients were being injected with a modified virus, supposedly to repair neurological damage. But then, something went wrong. It caused unpredictable mutations. The project was abandoned. Jake leaned in closer, a knot tightening in his chest. So they were experimenting on people in Cedarville, and now the outbreak is a consequence of what they did back then? Looks like it, Tommy replied, his tone heavy with frustration. But that doesn't explain why they're still covering it up. If this virus is mutating, it's not just about keeping a failed experiment under wraps. It's something worse. Later that day, while going through the photos Claire had taken, Jake noticed a name that stirred a memory he had long buried. Dr. Kenneth Pierce. It was listed under a section detailing research supervisors and key personnel involved in the early stages of the virus project. Jake's mind flashed back to his childhood, to a time when he'd hear his father mention Dr. Pierce's name in passing. It had seemed unimportant back then, just another colleague from his dad's work. But now it felt like a clue, a thread connecting the present danger to his past. Jake's father had been a lab technician who worked at the Cedarville clinic before his sudden death from a heart attack 10 years ago. It was a loss that had weighed on Jake's family, but he had never questioned the circumstances. Until now. If his dad had been involved with the original project, then perhaps his death had not been as natural as they had been led to believe. "I think my dad might have known about all of this," Jake said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. He worked at the clinic when the project was still running. If he found out something he wasn't supposed to, he could have been silenced, Claire finished, her eyes wide with the gravity of the realization. We need to find out more about what he was working on. With newfound determination, they dug deeper into the old files and traced the project's history back to its origin. The virus had been part of a government-funded initiative called Operation Cognition, a program that sought to develop experimental treatments for neurological conditions such as Alzheimer's and dementia. Using viruses as a vector for genetic manipulation, they aimed to restore damaged brain cells and improve cognitive abilities. The early tests seemed promising until the virus began to mutate. Patients involved in the trials started to exhibit severe neurological side effects, including paranoia, violent behavior, and eventually organ failure. The project was terminated after several participants died under mysterious circumstances. But it appeared that someone had kept the research going in secret, using the residents of Cedarville as unwilling test subjects. Jake's heart sank as he found more mentions of his father's name buried in the research notes, particularly in relation to the lab procedures conducted just before the project's abrupt end. It wasn't just that his father had been involved. He had been one of the lab's primary technicians, tasked with monitoring the stability of the virus samples. The grim implications weighed heavily on Jake. Had his father discovered something that got him killed? The thought made his blood run cold. He didn't know if he was driven more by the need for justice or by a gnawing guilt that he had never questioned his father's sudden death. Either way, he wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Meanwhile, it became apparent that they were being watched. On several occasions, they spotted unmarked cars parked near their houses. Agent Marshall had clearly taken note of their activities, and his gaze seemed to follow them wherever they went. Jake had caught sight of him several times in the past week, lingering at the edge of crowds or appearing in the distance just as the group was leaving a location. It was becoming increasingly clear that they were being monitored closely. Their suspicions were confirmed when Tommy, while snooping around the outskirts of the lab one night, didn't return at the agreed-upon time. Jake and Claire waited for hours, growing more and more anxious. It wasn't like Tommy to be late. He was the cautious one, the one who always insisted on contingency plans. When their attempts to reach him by phone failed, panic began to set in. Jake's stomach twisted with dread as he and Claire combed through the streets, calling Tommy's name and checking every possible hiding spot. Eventually, they found his backpack near a drainage ditch behind the facility's fence, its contents scattered as though there had been a struggle. "Someone took him," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "And it wasn't just the authorities. I think it was whoever's behind all this." Jake could barely focus as they returned to the garage, his thoughts racing from fear to rage. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, that whatever was happening in Cedarville was accelerating, and now Tommy's life was at risk. Desperation clawed at him. They had only scratched the surface of the truth, and yet they were already in over their heads. They needed to figure out what Phase 2 entailed, and fast. Whatever it was, it couldn't be good, and with Tommy missing, they had no choice but to risk everything to find him. As the reality of their situation settled in, Jake's determination hardened into something unbreakable. He wasn't just seeking answers anymore. He was ready to fight for them, whatever the cost. The walls were closing in, and the echoes of the past threatened to consume them all. But Jake wasn't going to let Cedarville's secrets stay buried. Not when the lives of his friends and the legacy of his father hung in the balance. The chapter ended with a message from an unknown number flashing on Jake's phone. "You're running out of time. Leave this alone, or you'll end up like him." Chapter 5. The Dark Beneath. Jake's pulse quickened as he and Claire crept toward the rear entrance of the Cedarville Medical Clinic under the cover of night. The air was damp, with the chill of early morning, and a thick fog had rolled in, cloaking their approach. They kept low, moving swiftly but silently, knowing they had only one shot at getting inside without being detected. If they were caught, it wasn't just Tommy's life at stake. They might never get the chance to expose the truth. Claire glanced at Jake, her eyes determined. "The blueprints we found show an old service tunnel that leads directly to the underground bunker. It's supposed to be sealed, but if we're lucky they haven't reinforced it. We'll use that to get in." Jake nodded, his jaw clenched with grim resolve. "Let's move. We don't have much time." Navigating through the narrow service tunnel, they came to a rusted metal door embedded in the concrete wall. It groaned loudly as Jake wrenched it open, revealing a dimly lit stairway leading down. As they descended, the air grew cooler, carrying a faint chemical smell that stung their nostrils. The deeper they went, the more Jake felt the weight of what they were about to uncover pressing down on him like the darkness surrounding them. At the bottom of the stairway lay a series of interconnected hallways, lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The corridors branched off in multiple directions, lined with faded signs marked Research Wing and Containment Area. The place felt more like a maze than a facility, designed to keep secrets rather than reveal them. Jake and Claire followed the map they had pieced together from stolen documents, making their way to a secured door marked Restricted Access. Claire quickly got to work bypassing the electronic lock using a small device she had rigged together from spare parts. "It's open," she whispered. "Let's go." Inside, they found themselves in a sterile lab, its white walls streaked with stains and its counters cluttered with vials, syringes, and lab reports. Jake's heart tightened as they spotted Tommy, unconscious and strapped to a gurney in the corner. His face was pale, and an IV dripped a translucent liquid into his arm. As they rushed over to free him, Jake noticed a row of computer monitors displaying security footage. He froze, his gaze fixed on one of the screens. There, in grainy black and white, was Sarah, one of the missing students. The footage showed her restrained in another part of the facility, her eyes wide with terror as masked figures in lab coats loomed over her. They injected something into her arm while she writhed in pain, her muffled screams echoing through the speakers. "Sarah," Jake breathed, horrified. They were experimenting on her. This wasn't about finding a cure. They were using these kids as lab rats. Claire's hands trembled as she ripped out the IV from Tommy's arm and helped him to his feet. "We need to get him out of here, now." But before they could take another step, a voice echoed through the lab. "So you finally found your way down here." Dr. Caldwell emerged from the shadows, his expression weary and conflicted. He raised his hands, showing he wasn't armed. "I figured it was only a matter of time before you discovered the truth." Jake's eyes narrowed, anger surging in his chest. "Why? Why did you do this to them? To all of us?" Dr. Hap Caldwell's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his actions had crushed him long ago. "I never wanted any of this," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "When the initial trials went wrong, I tried to shut it down, but the government wouldn't let me. They threatened my family, forced me to continue the research. I thought if I could find a cure, I could undo the damage. But every step I took only made things worse. That's no excuse. Claire spat, her voice shaking. "You still went along with it. You still let them hurt people." The doctor's face hardened as he glanced at the security monitors. "You don't understand. Agent Marshall isn't just a government agent. He's the one who revived the project in secret, manipulating me and the others to continue. He's been behind every step of this. He's the real mastermind." Jake's mind raced. They had suspected that Agent Marshall was more than just an investigator, but to learn he was the orchestrator behind the experiments took their suspicions to a new level. Now, they weren't just fighting to uncover the truth. They were fighting against someone who would do anything to keep it buried. Tommy stirred, groaning as he regained consciousness. "Where am I?" he murmured, his eyes fluttering open. "We're getting you out of here," Jake said quickly. "Can you walk?" Tommy nodded weakly, though his legs wobbled as he tried to stand. They supported him between them, moving swiftly toward the exit. But before they could reach the stairwell, alarms blared and red lights flashed throughout the facility. The harsh sound echoed off the walls, signaling that their intrusion had been detected. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hall outside, growing louder as they drew closer. "Go! Get out of here while you can," Dr. Caldwell urged, his voice filled with urgency. "The virus has started to mutate again. If it spreads beyond Cedarville, there's no telling how many lives will be lost. You have to stop it." As if on cue, a metallic clang resounded, and the doors at the end of the corridor burst open. Agent Marshall strode in, flanked by armed guards. His expression was one of cold satisfaction as he locked eyes with Jake. "Well, well," Marshall said, a twisted smile curling on his lips. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find this place. You've come too far, kid. Time to put an end to your little crusade." Jake's breath caught in his throat. They were outnumbered and outgunned, with no clear way out. The walls seemed to close in around them, and for a moment, it felt like the darkness of the bunker would swallow them whole. But as his mind raced for a solution, one thing was clear. No matter what happened next, they were not giving up. Claire's grip tightened on Jake's arm, her eyes blazing with defiance. "We're not backing down," she whispered. "Not now." Marshall's smile faded, and he gestured to his guards. "Detain them," he ordered. "We're moving on to phase 2, and make sure they don't leave this place alive." As the guards closed in, Jake braced himself for the confrontation that would determine not just their fates, but the fate of the entire town. The truth was almost within their grasp, but if they failed now, Cedarville's dark past would consume them all. Chapter 6: The Labyrinth Unveiled. Jake, Claire, and Tommy sprinted through the narrow corridors of the underground facility, their hearts racing as the echoes of their footsteps mingled with the blaring alarms. The chaos of their escape pushed them forward, fueled by desperation and the weight of their revelations. They needed to find a way out and expose the truth before it was too late. "Over here!" Claire shouted, spotting a rusted hatch tucked behind a stack of forgotten crates. Jake and Tommy pushed against it, and with a grunt, it swung open, revealing a tunnel that sloped downward into darkness. "Let's go," Jake urged, ushering them inside. The dim light of the tunnel barely illuminated their path, but they pressed on, feeling the urgency of the moment. The air grew cooler, and the faint scent of earth filled their lungs. As they navigated the twisting passage, Jake couldn't shake the fear gnawing at his insides. They had uncovered the horrifying truth about the experiments. But what if Agent Marshall and his enforcers were already waiting for them above ground? What if they never made it out alive? After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a hidden exit just outside the woods bordering Cedarville. Gasping for breath, they stumbled into the moonlight, the cool night air washing over them like a wave of relief. "We did it," Tommy panted, looking at his friends with wide eyes. "We're free, but we need to go public with what we found," Claire insisted, determination flooding her voice. "We can't let them sweep this under the rug. The town deserves to know what's happening here." Jake nodded, but uncertainty lingered in his mind. "But what if they come after us? We're still in danger." "We have to take that risk," Claire replied fiercely. "If we stay silent, more people will suffer. We've seen too much to turn back now." With a plan forming, they hurried to the local newspaper office, the flickering neon sign illuminating their path. As they burst through the doors, the sound of their urgency startled the night staff. "Get the editor. We have something to share, something that could save lives." Within minutes, they were ushered into the back room, where the editor, a burly man with disheveled hair, raised an eyebrow at their frantic entrance. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone skeptical but intrigued. As they relayed their story, the editor's expression shifted from disbelief to shock, then to grim resolve. "If what you're saying is true, this is huge. I'll publish it immediately." Meanwhile, Agent Marshall sat in his dimly lit office, his hands steepled in front of him. The news that Jake and his friends had escaped reached him, igniting a storm of rage within. He slammed his fist on the desk, scattering papers and empty coffee cups. "They can't expose what we've built here," he hissed to himself, feeling the familiar ache of loss flood back to the forefront of his mind. As he replayed the events of the past days, he was reminded of the daughter he had lost. One of the missing students whose life had been a casualty of the very experiments he was now desperate to control. The image of her smiling face was a constant reminder of his failure, fueling his desire for revenge against a system that had betrayed them all. Back at the newspaper, Jake, Claire, and Tommy sat in a tense silence, waiting for the editor to finish drafting their story. Minutes felt like hours, as the gravity of their actions weighed heavily on their shoulders. Finally, the editor emerged, holding a printed copy of the article, the headline bold and undeniable: "Cedarville's Dark Secret, the untold story of medical experiments and missing students." "This goes live first thing in the morning," he announced, handing them a copy. "We'll need your help with follow-up interviews and investigations. You've got a lot of people interested in what you have to say." But just as relief began to wash over them, the doors swung open violently and Agent Marshall stormed in, flanked by 2 armed guards. The trio froze, realizing they had little time to act. "Did you really think you could get away with this?" Marshall seethed, his eyes filled with a mix of fury and desperation. "You have no idea what you're messing with." Jake stepped forward, his fear replaced by determination. "We're not afraid of you. This ends now." Marshall's gaze hardened. "You think you've uncovered everything, but you have no idea about the scope of what's happening. You're playing with forces beyond your comprehension." In a flash, Claire stepped in front of Jake and Tommy, a defiant look on her face. "You lost your child, but this isn't justice. You're hurting innocent people." Marshall's expression faltered, revealing a moment of vulnerability. "They were supposed to be perfect. My child was supposed to be safe. I thought I could make it right." Just then, the sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder. Marshall's guards shifted uneasily, exchanging worried glances as they realized the authorities were closing in. "Get ready," Marshall commanded, the anger rising in his voice. "We need to leave. Now!" But Jake and his friends stood their ground. "You won't get away with this," Tommy shouted, rage coursing through him. "You have to answer for your actions." A moment of chaos erupted as the door burst open again, and federal agents flooded the room. Marshall's guards scrambled to defend him, but the sheer number of agents overwhelmed them in seconds. "Hands in the air," one of the agents shouted, cornering Marshall against the wall. As the officers apprehended the guards, the editor took a step back, his face pale. "This isn't over," Marshall snarled, shooting a venomous glare at Jake, Claire, and Tommy. "You have no idea what's been set in motion." With Agent Marshall and his guards taken into custody, the atmosphere shifted from one of tension to tentative relief. The friends watched as the federal agents began to assess the situation, securing the area. They could hardly believe they had made it through the night alive. Dr. Caldwell appeared behind the agents, visibly shaken but resolute. "I'm here to help. I want to make amends for my role in all of this," he said earnestly, stepping forward. "There's so much more to this than you realize. The virus, it's still evolving." As the authorities began to dismantle the facility, the friends knew they had just begun to scratch the surface of a far larger conspiracy. Days later, Cedarville slowly began to heal, the scars of the past lingering but giving way to a hopeful future. Jake, Claire, and Tommy sat together in the park, reflecting on everything they had experienced. "It's hard to believe it's finally over," Claire mused, watching the sunlight dance through the trees. "But is it really over?" Tommy asked quietly, pulling something from his backpack. "What do you mean?" Jake inquired, a frown creasing his brow. Tommy handed Jake an old envelope, its corners yellowed and frayed. "I found this in the bunker before we escaped. It looks like it's from your dad." Jake's hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope, curiosity and dread coiling together in his chest. He carefully opened it, revealing a letter written in his father's familiar scrawl. "If you're reading this, it means you've uncovered some of the truth. But there's more hidden beneath the surface. The experiments aren't over. They never were. I've seen things that will make your skin crawl. You must find the other lab, and you must do it soon. They are still out there." Jake's heart sank as he read the ominous words. The dark reality of the experiments was far from finished. "There's another lab?" he whispered, the weight of his father's warning settling heavily upon him. Claire and Tommy exchanged concerned glances, the hope they had felt moments ago dissipating into the air. "Then we have to find it," Claire declared, her determination rekindling. "Whatever it takes." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the park, Jake knew they couldn't stop now. They had come too far to turn back. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead, even if it meant diving deeper into the shadows of Cedarville's past.